more. There is something you have carried your entire life, a feeling so quiet, so constant, that you almost stopped noticing it. The feeling that no matter where you went, no matter how hard you tried, something in you never fully arrived. You sat at tables full of people who were laughing, and you smiled, but behind your eyes, something was watching. Something was waiting, not for the conversation to end, not for the night to be over, for something else entirely, something you could never name. You were told you were too sensitive, too deep, too much, or sometimes not enough. You learned to shrink yourself into shapes that fit the spaces others made for you. You learned to translate yourself into a language that the world around you could understand. And every single time you did that, every single time you made yourself smaller, something inside you went quiet in a way that took days to recover from. That something has a name, and it has been trying to reach you for a very long time. What you are about to hear is not a teaching. It is not a theory. It is a recognition, and if it lands the way it is meant to land, you will not be the same person at the end of this that you were at the beginning. Stay with this. There is a particular kind of loneliness that no one warns you about. Not the loneliness of being alone in a room, or the loneliness of losing someone you love. This is something quieter, something that lives beneath the surface of every ordinary conversation you have ever had. It is the feeling of standing in a crowded room, surrounded by laughter and noise, and realizing with absolute clarity that something inside you is tuned to a frequency that no one else around you can hear. You smile, you nod, you say the right things at the right moments. More. But somewhere deep inside, behind your eyes, there is a witness watching all of it, and that witness has always known that you were not quite built the same way as everyone else. If you have felt this, then what follows is not a video. It is a recognition. And recognition in the oldest mystical traditions is not learning something new. It is remembering something you were never supposed to forget. The ancient Greeks had a word for divine feminine wisdom, Sophia. Not wisdom as information, not wisdom as strategy. Sophia as a living presence, a cosmic intelligence that moves through certain souls the way wind moves through an open window. In the Gnostic traditions, Sophia was not merely a concept. She was a being, a conscious emanation of the divine who descended into matter and experienced what it meant to be lost, forgotten, and then found again. The Gnostic texts describe her as weeping in the depths of the material world, calling out to those rare souls who still carried the memory of where they came from. And the ones who heard her were always the ones who felt different. They were always the ones who could not fully belong to the world they had been born into, because part of them was already elsewhere. This is not poetry written to make you feel special. This is a pattern so consistent across so many traditions, so many centuries, so many cultures, that to dismiss it as coincidence would require more faith than to accept it as signal. More. Ibn Arabi, the great Andalusian mystic of the 13th century, wrote about a category of human beings he called the Awliya, the friends of the divine, who moved through the world wearing the costume of ordinary life, but whose inner reality was oriented towards something that could not be named in the language of the marketplace. He did not say they were better than others. He said they were differently configured. Their hearts, he wrote, were like mirrors turned toward a light that most people had their backs to. They did not choose this orientation. It chose them. And the consequence of being chosen by such a light is that everything ordinary begins to look slightly unreal, slightly thin, like a stage set that almost convinces you but not quite. Carl Jung spent decades mapping the interior landscape of the human psyche, and what he found at its deepest layers was not chaos but structure and archetypal grammar that the soul uses to organize its experience of being alive. He called the deepest layer the self, not the ego, not the personality, not the social mask, but the totality of what a person is and is becoming. And what he noticed again and again in the individuals who came to him carrying the heaviest burdens was that their suffering was not pathological in the ordinary sense. It was the suffering of individuation, the painful process of a soul being pressed by an inner force toward its own unique form. These were people who could not simply adapt and conform and find peace in the consensus version of reality. Something in them refused. Something in them kept asking questions that had no comfortable answers. More. Something in them kept waking up in the middle of the night with a feeling that they were missing something enormous, something just beyond the edge of ordinary perception. Jung did not call this something Sophia by name, but he circled it constantly. He called it the anima in men, the inner feminine principle that carries the soul's deepest intuitions. He called it the unconscious speaking through symbols and dreams and synchronicities. He spent the last decades of his life writing a document he called the Red Book, a record of his descent into his own interior world, and what he encountered there was not darkness alone but a luminous presence, a wisdom that seemed to know things his conscious mind could not access. He was a scientist, a physician, a man trained in the strictest empirical tradition of 19th century Europe, and he could not deny what he had experienced. The inner world was real. The wisdom that lived there was real, and it spoke most clearly to those who had suffered most deeply, to those who had been cracked open by life in ways that others had not. The Vedantic traditions of India approach this from a different angle but arrive at the same place. In Advaita Vedanta, the teaching of non-duality, the fundamental nature of reality is described as Satchitananda, being, consciousness, bliss. Not three things but one thing seen from three angles. And the path toward the recognition of this reality is not a path of accumulation, accumulating more knowledge, more techniques, more practices, but a path of subtraction. Stripping away every false identification until what remains is what was always already there. The great sage Ramana Maharshi, who spent most of his adult life in the silence of Arunachala, used to say that the question, "Who am I?" was not a philosophical puzzle to be solved by the intellect. It was a sword. It was meant to cut through every layer of assumed identity until the one who was asking the question could no longer be found as a separate object. What remained after that cutting was not nothing. It was everything. It was the silent awareness that had been present through every experience, every thought, every feeling, the witness that never moved, even as everything within its field of awareness moved constantly. The people who are drawn to this teaching are not drawn to it because they read about it in a book and found it intellectually interesting. They are drawn to it because something in their direct experience has already been pointing toward it for years. They have already noticed the witness. They have already felt the strange doubling, the part of them that is inside the experience, and the part that is watching the experience from somewhere that feels like no particular place at all. This is not a psychological disorder. This is an early symptom of what the traditions call awakening, the beginning of the soul's recognition of its own nature, and Sophia is the name for the intelligence that orchestrates this recognition. She is not a goddess in the mythological sense, not a being who sits somewhere in the sky and occasionally intervenes in human affairs. She is the wisdom principle that is woven into the fabric of consciousness itself, the intelligence that knows what each soul needs in order to remember what it is. And she works primarily through contrast, through rupture, through the places where ordinary life fails to satisfy. She works through the moments when everything you were supposed to want suddenly feels hollow. She works through the relationships that break you open rather than comfort you. She works through the books that find you at exactly the right moment, the conversations that change everything, the silences that speak louder than any words ever could. The Sufi poets understood this with a ferocity that still burns through their words centuries later. Rumi did not write about longing as a problem to be solved. He wrote about longing as the evidence of origin. The reed flute cries because it has been cut from the reed bed, and that cry is not mere suffering. That cry is music. That cry is the sound of a soul that has not forgotten where it came from, even while living in the land of forgetting. The separation is real. The pain is real, but the pain itself is the proof of connection, because only something that was once united can suffer from division. The loneliness that certain souls feel in this world is not evidence that they are broken. It is evidence that they carry within them a memory of something whole, and the world as it is currently configured cannot satisfy that memory. Nothing in the material world can satisfy it, and that incapacity, that fundamental dissatisfaction, is exactly what Sophia uses as her doorway. The Kabbalistic tradition speaks of the concept of the Orion Sof, the infinite light, and the vessels that were created to hold it. In the Lurianic cosmology, there was a moment called the Shevarat Ha-Kelim, the shattering of the vessels. The vessels could not contain the fullness of the light, and they broke, and the sparks of that original light scattered throughout the material world, becoming embedded in everything, in matter, in suffering, in darkness, in confusion. The purpose of human spiritual life, in this framework, is the gathering of those scattered sparks, the tikkun olam, the repair of the world. But the souls who are called to this work are not ordinary souls in the Kabbalistic understanding. They are souls who carry more of the original light than others, and that is precisely why they suffer more, why the world feels too heavy for them, why they sense a fracture at the heart of things that others seem able to ignore. They are not more sensitive because they are weak, they are more sensitive because they are carrying more. Their permeability to suffering is inseparable from their capacity for illumination. This pattern, the chosen one who suffers, the seer who cannot unsee, the soul that feels exiled in its own life, is not a pathology. It is an initiation. Every genuine mystical tradition in human history has recognized it as such. The shaman who is called through illness, the prophet who is undone by vision, the mystic who is emptied before they can be filled. The common thread running through all of these is not suffering for its own sake, but transformation through a particular kind of pressure, the pressure that comes when the soul's deepest truth can no longer be contained within the structures that ordinary life provides. And the people who know this pressure most intimately are always the ones who felt different from the very beginning. Long before they had any framework for understanding why, they knew. They could feel it in the quality of their attention, in the way certain sunsets stopped them completely, in the way they could sense what was unspoken in a room full of people, in the way they could not be satisfied by explanations that seemed to satisfy everyone else. More. Sophia speaks to these souls not through extraordinary visions or dramatic supernatural events, though these do sometimes occur. She speaks most consistently through the ordinary texture of a life that refuses to let itself be lived unconsciously. She speaks through the book that falls open to exactly the right page, through the stranger whose single sentence lands like a stone dropped into still water, through the dream that is somehow more real than waking life, through the moment of inexplicable grief that arrives without reason in the middle of an otherwise ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the grief that, when you sit with it instead of pushing it away, turns out not to be grief at all, but a strange and aching beauty, a love so vast it has nowhere to land in the ordinary dimensions of human life. The philosopher Alfred North Whitehead once wrote that religion is what a person does with their solitude. But for the souls Sophia claims, it goes deeper than that. For these souls, solitude is not something they retreat into from time to time. It is their natural atmosphere. Not isolation. There is an important distinction. Isolation is the absence of connection. The solitude Whitehead was pointing toward, the solitude that the mystics inhabit, is a fullness, a plenum, a silence so complete it contains everything. These are the people who can sit in a room alone and feel accompanied. These are the people who find more genuine contact in a line of rilke than in a week of social interaction. These are the people for whom the question of the soul is not abstract but urgent, not a philosophical hobby, but an existential necessity. And what Sophia offers these souls is not comfort in the conventional sense. More. She does not promise that the feeling of difference will go away, that one day they will finally fit in, that the longing will finally be satisfied by something external. What she offers is something far more radical, a reframe so complete it changes everything without changing anything. She offers the recognition that the difference was never a defect, that the longing was never a wound, that the inability to fully settle into consensus reality was never a failure of adaptation but a success of a different kind, the success of a soul that has remained faithful to something in itself that the world has not yet learned to name. In the Hermetic tradition, the phrase "as above so below" carries a teaching that most people encounter only on its surface, but its deeper meaning is that the structure of the inner world and the structure of the outer world are not two separate systems, they are one system seen from two angles. And the souls who feel different, who carry the Sophia quality of consciousness, are not simply different in their personalities or their preferences. They are differently structured at a fundamental level. Their inner world has an architecture that corresponds to dimensions of reality that the consensus world has not yet mapped. They are not ahead of their time in any arrogant sense. They are simply tuned to frequencies that the current cultural conversation has not yet found the instruments to measure. And this is why they feel lonely. Not because there is no one who could understand them, but because the language for what they carry has not yet been fully spoken into the common conversation of their time. They are living at a threshold. More. They are people of the threshold, what the Celtic traditions called the liminal ones, the ones who stand between worlds and can see in both directions. This is not a comfortable position. The threshold is cold and exposed. There is no community of the threshold in the way there is community of the settled land. But the threshold is also where all genuine transformation happens. It is the only place where the old can dissolve and the new can form. And the souls who inhabit it are not lost, they are necessary. Sophia has always known where to find them. She has always known who they are, long before they knew themselves. She has always been the intelligence moving through their restlessness, their questioning, their inability to settle for less than the whole truth. She has been the force behind every book they read that cracked something open, every practice that took them deeper than they expected to go, every relationship that demanded they become more than they thought they could be, every loss that turned out in hindsight to have been a liberation in disguise. The recognition Sophia offers is not a destination. It is not a state to be achieved and maintained. It is a quality of presence that becomes available when a soul stops fighting its own nature, when it stops trying to be less sensitive, less questioning, less awake, and begins instead to inhabit its own difference with a kind of dignity. Not the dignity of pride, which is still a performance for an audience. The dignity of self-possession. The quiet certainty of a soul that has finally stopped apologizing for what it is and has begun, instead, to ask what it is for. More. There is a moment in the Gospel of Thomas, one of the Gnostic texts recovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, where Jesus says something that no canonical gospel preserves in quite this form. He says, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." This is not a threat, it is a description of a natural law. The soul that refuses to become what it is does not simply stagnate, it turns against itself. The unfulfilled depth becomes anxiety, becomes depression, becomes the particular modern disease of a life that looks successful from the outside and feels empty from the inside. Sophia is the intelligence that will not allow this stagnation indefinitely. She will use whatever is necessary, illness, loss, crisis, unexpected grace, to break through the accommodations a soul has made with its own unlived life. And here is the final recognition, the one that changes everything. The feeling of being different was never about being superior. It was never about being chosen in any exclusive sense. It was about being configured for a particular kind of service, the service of depth, the service of questioning, the service of remaining awake in a world that has powerful reasons to stay asleep. The souls who feel Sophia's pull are not meant to withdraw from life. They are meant to bring something back from the depths that the surface world desperately needs, even when it does not know it needs it, even when it actively resists the offering. You have always known you were carrying something. You have always sensed that the difference you felt was not a mistake. Spent years, perhaps decades, trying to understand it, to name it, to find others who carried the same unnamed thing. And Sophia has been present in all of that searching, not as a destination waiting at the end of a road, but as the quality of the search itself. She is not something you arrive at. She is something you have always been moving from. The silence you feel right now, reading these words, is not emptiness. It is the oldest kind of recognition, the kind that happens not in the mind, but somewhere beneath the mind, in the place where knowing and being are the same thing. You were not built for the surface. You were built for the depth, and the depth has always been waiting with perfect patience for exactly this moment, the moment when you stop running from what you are and turn, finally, to face it. That turning is what Sophia calls awakening, and it has already begun.
I personally researched, wrote, and prepared this video to bring your accurate and meaningful content. Subscribe for more original content.